So if you will, please make welcome Mr. Jonathan Ortmans. Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ballins, and thank you, Dr. Clark, and all the other distinguished guests, and particularly congratulations to the MEC and to those that have already kick-started this initiative. It's really quite impressive. In fact, I think it's unprecedented around the country, the level of participation that folks in Mississippi give to something like this when there's trying to be an introspective effort at trying to improve one's lot. And I really think everyone who came to all of those roadshows should be congratulated, and particularly Blake Wilson, who I know from doing lots of public forums really deserves credit for stamina, if for nothing else, making it across the state. So first of all, I apologize for my accent. I have been coming to Mississippi for about 10 years, but I still haven't learned how to speak English yet. But so if you don't understand what I'm saying, my sincere apologies. But I want to begin, if we can, with first of all an observation that it may not just be that I could look at data and see something different to what you see when you look at data. It could be that there's a difference among you. And I try to think, well, what could I do to demonstrate this? And I pick one thing, and if you've already seen this before, be absent. If you haven't seen this before, answer the question honestly, okay? Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 sentences. I want to tell me what's the first thing that comes into your head, and then if you would, call it out. Here are the 3 sentences. There's a man with a mask. There is a man at home. There's a man coming home. What's the first thing that pops in your head? Oh, a chain? Jason from Friday the 13th. All right. Okay. Did I hear surgeon over here? No. What? Any other things? What's the first thing that comes into your head? A catcher. Okay. Who thought of something else? Batman. A robber. A Mardi Gras ball. All right. Well, we happen to be on the same wavelength, sir, because when I read these sentences, I also see baseball. But I will tell you, I can come up with 15 different images that will be conjured up in your mind. So when we talk about data, we have to be careful to make sure that we don't read too much into it. And I wanted to start this following the initial outputs of the roadshow, where there was, I think, a lot of attention given to how folks in Mississippi think about themselves and their possible future as a growth state. And this is something which is a quotation from Robert Lucas, who's one of the Nobel laureates. But he wrote here that if you really want to have an impact, here's what we really have to do. A large fraction of people here in this state must experience changes in the possible lives they imagine for themselves. That's why I think the questions that Blake asked the public were so important. What do you perceive as possible? Because they have to imagine that for them and their children, so they're not going to leave the state. And they have to be able to see this in a way, this vision, where it has enough force to lead them to change the way they behave. And I think this is vital as we look to whether or not you really have an impact on something. You can actually tell whether or not you've transformed our own perceptions about what we see as the possible. And I think that's part of the effort of Blueprint, to see if there's a way with this extraordinary participation that one can bring everybody on the same page in terms of a collective effort at having an impact. All right. So what does the data tell us so far? If we scan the data in the first scan, the leaders of Blueprint have really picked the right 4 kinds of areas. First of all, clearly education, and I'm going to cover this less today than others because we've already had the panel this morning and there's lots more to come. Secondly, in the context of resource management, we're seeing digital capacity, transportation, energy efficiency. I think the data tells us that whatever you do, research and development is paramount in the 21st century in order to be able to grow economies. And finally, and this is something which may be a little bit less popular today, but that's part of my job. Blake said you get to be one of the people who looks from outside looking in, but also to report honestly on what the data says. And I'll call it for the moment young firms. Let me first of all, let me walk through these quickly then if I can and give you a couple of interesting things. First of all, I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room about the importance of education. I think in a way I'm wasting your time if I walk through a whole array of national statistics. And also, do you want me to start at the beginning of the continuum or the end of continuum? But here's one that actually I read the other day that I think just says it all. When we have a quarter of our nation who cannot pass the basic military entrance exam to get into the military, I think that says it all, that we know we have a significant challenge upon us. And I think as we looked at the data, at the end of the day, we need to do a better job as far as teacher prep, and we need to do a better job as far as reaching our children as early as possible. So we're going to cover more in discussions later, but I'm going to focus on the other three areas for the balance of this morning. So in the resource management area, as I mentioned, three areas that kind of stuck out to us that clearly the conclusion that one would reach is that Mississippi's doing a great job. Let's first of all, however, look at digital. In terms of digital infrastructure, Mississippi actually gets very high grades for its work in state government and healthcare. The Mississippi Health Information Network is actually a model practice nationally. But Mississippi, as we heard mentioned earlier, has the lowest broadband penetration rate in the U.S. and is 50th in terms of overall size of our internet population. Secondly, we look at transportation. A much more encouraging picture. Mississippi did a major effort on its highway system. Super success, rated 16th nationally. Super investments in terms of maintenance, reduced congestion, and reduced highway fatalities. Mississippi has extraordinary infrastructure assets in terms of rail systems, in terms of waterways, and in terms of airports. So from a perspective of transportation, there is a strong case that essentially says we need to continue on the path that we're continuing of. The strategy ain't broke. This is an area that has given, the data tells us that there is a strong level of performance. Energy. Well, you probably all know that Mississippi is a net exporter of energy. Mississippi's utilities have a strong, not national reputation, but a strong global reputation. And you know that there is emerging potential in terms of biomass because of in relation to forestry and agriculture. And there's also a lot of work going on in trying to assess when it will become economically viable to be looking at renewable energy sources. There is plenty of opportunity there. The question is always going to be the timing, whether it be in terms of green manufacturing that's beginning to take note. I mean, you're all familiar with the new plant in Olive Branch. But enormous success, I think, in the energy arena. And I think one of the things that's important to observe is there are a lot of people in this state that are watching how the renewable energy world is emerging and when and how is the right way for the state to engage, given its other strengths in the other more traditional sources of energy. In transportation, energy and in digital infrastructure, these are areas where there's great strength. We think that Blueprint Mississippi clearly needs to do a more comprehensive asset map when it comes to better understanding the other assets and resources that the state has to work with. And we should continue on the path when it comes to looking at energy efficiency and the transportation work. And I applaud the fact that it was already mentioned. The digital issue I mentioned apparently is already underway in terms of MBCC and the work of Jim Barksdale and others in really leading the charge at addressing that issue of broadband. So two more areas before I wrap up. One is commercialization. So I mentioned research and development is absolutely crucial to this. Mississippi has been strong in this, as we know from the 4 research universities. The state ranks in the top 10 for levels of academic R&D but lags when it comes to private industry investments. In 2009, you're looking at, there were 10 new licenses, 51 new invention disclosures, and 11 new patents and 43 new patent applications. Now, there are some states, of course, that have got stronger numbers, but this is a great base. If there was one message I would lead in this regard, it would be, it would be this, and that is, you have to help. I think the research universities are very aware that this is absolutely essential for the future growth of the state. But it's just as important that the business community reaches into the research universities as it is as the university researchers figure out how can they move their innovations out into the marketplace faster. And as you look at this area in the center here, you're seeing on the left, essentially, you've got labs and a lot of the great research that's going on. And on the end, you've got obviously the kind of people that take those ideas and put them into the marketplace. And that requires teams of everybody from angels to companies with engineering capacities and so forth. But in that place in the center, you can't just leave it to one technology transfer officer in each university. You have to help that become reality. You have to become a part of that, because you will see things, just like those sentences I put up there, that others don't see. So I think if there was one message there, it would be that you have to engage. So at the end of the day, the most important areas of focus in research and university need to be that you have to continue the effort to try to enhance the roles that the universities play in getting the economic value out of the research that's there. Find new ways of trying to stimulate industry research. This is enormously difficult on a national level, and I'll make comment about that in a minute before I wrap up. You also have to attract world-class researchers. This is absolutely vital. You'll know that the best research often comes about because people move to work in a research arena because there is a world-class researcher there. And finally, just building an even stronger base for technology commercialization on the campuses. So this is another one where there's need for continued engagement by the state in helping the research institutions to leverage the existing capacity that they've already put in place. And as I told you, there are several things in the economic competitiveness angle where I'm going to itemize, but I'm going to pick out one which I cannot help. I would be dishonest if I were not to point out a few data points to you in terms of what is a transforming economic force on the national level. And it's really to do with young firms. I want to take a look at this opening thought here. You know, in terms of state economies, the question is it really the economy that grows, or is it individual firms that grow and shrink that define the collective fate of the economy? And I think more and more we need to be thinking about it in the context of the latter. And if you do that, I can tell you that a recent study showed that as we look at Washington and we see the chairman of the Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, arguing with the President of the United States over what on earth to do about trying to fix our long-term budget crisis, there's one other option out there, and that is to increase GDP by 1 percentage point. And do you know one of the ways you could do that? If you were to increase from 15 to 45 the number of billion-dollar firms in the United States, you would increase our GDP by a full 1%. That's approximately increasing it. Sorry, that would be another quarter of GDP, given that we are always teetering around 3% on average. So the importance of these new young firms as their potential to become one of those billion-dollar iconic brands is absolutely essential from both a state economic perspective as well as from a national economic perspective. And let me just mention one other thing, and I'll give you a Mississippi number in a minute, but the other thing is that if you look at that bottom bullet on this slide, it's very interesting because the number of new businesses has hit a very high level in the United States. In fact, it's the highest that it's been in 15 years despite the recession. Now, it is evidently the case that they're hiring fewer people, but they are starting firms. So we're seeing this as a national trend, and one that I think is essential, because as this data points out, and this is the data which has been used both by the Speaker of the House last month and by the President of the United States 2 months ago, both the President with something called Startup America and the Speaker of the House with his own initiative. Essentially what this points out to you is that, and I'll point out what these graphs mean, but the blue lines at the top are job creation in startups. The red lines are in terms of net job creation absent startups. So there's only very few years since this goes back to 1977, and this is Department of Labor data, where there has ever been net job creation when there was without startups. So you'll see that all of those blue years, it essentially says without the startups there would be no positive job growth in the United States. So let's just examine what that means. Essentially, it means that all net job growth in the last 25 years has come from firms less than 5 years old. And that tells you something very, very important. And what does that tell you to the existing, those of you with existing companies and with traditional existing industries? You need those startups in order to retain the dynamism within the firm to continue to grow. And that's really what's happening. This week, for example, I happen to know the CEO of Blackboard, and he's called me up yesterday actually and said, you know, have you seen what's going on here? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, we're about to get acquired. I mean, you've got a company where he will look back and tell you the only way his existing company managed to grow was because every year he held a convention of startups. And you know what he did? He kept acquiring and acquiring and acquiring them. So rather than having his own R&D department in the company, he would acquire small groups of startups that came up with innovative ways in the education space to come up with new innovations. And now he's got a firm which is, as I say, which is probably going to be a record sale of a large growth iconic brand. So as the older firms recede, essentially the high growth firms create the new wealth and jobs by injecting the dynamism. But finally, let me tell you this, and this is the really interesting thing. I mean, the average age of a US-born entrepreneur is 39 years old. Most people think some modern-day Mozart in a garage who's 21 years old comes up with some creative idea. And this is where this is relevant to every single one of you in the room and every single existing firm in the room. And that is that in order to be successful, you need unique knowledge. You need knowledge of an existing industry. So whether we're talking about advanced manufacturing, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about tourism, whatever it is we're talking about, that's where I'm suggesting that the startup innovations have to occur. Because at the end of the day, you can have young people teaming with people with more experience, but without that person with more experience, they're much more likely to fail. And also, it doesn't have to be in technology. I noticed the questions on the roadshow talked about startups in tech startups. Think about Starbucks. I mean, Starbucks, simple, you just reinvented the idea of a cup of coffee. You know, I think a lot of the time the innovation can be very, very, very low tech and have a huge economic potential. And then finally, and this is interesting, if you look at this data on this slide, you'll see that Mississippi startup rates are actually near the top in the US between 1999 and 2003, and Mississippi ranked number 3 in new ventures. Now, admittedly, a lot of those new ventures didn't hire many people. They started those firms. But there is a tradition here of being able to do that I think is sometimes overlooked. And I think you'll find that more and more, as less infrastructure is required in this environment, you'll see more and more potential for this. So that, combined with recognizing the focus on which existing industries one needs to concentrate on, which I think the roadshow has told us a lot of interesting data about in terms of Mississippi's perspective on that, combined with what I think came out of this morning's panel, which is a greater emphasis on workforce development, and that combined with understanding how to have all regions in the state benefit from this really becomes a starting point for where our economic competitiveness team might focus. So I'm very bullish on this, I have to admit. You know, I'm not supposed to be the cheerleader, okay? So, everything we see is actually very encouraging, despite the fact that some people said to me, oh, well, you know, don't bring me rankings of how we rate on this, this, and this, because sometimes it's not so encouraging for us. I got to tell you, from working in other states, they've got much worse problems. And so I'm bullish on Mississippi. I'm delighted to see that you're here and you're bullish too. And I hope very much that as we move forward with this process, I have the opportunity to indirectly hear from as many of you as possible as to how we can make this something which was an historical moment for the state in terms of responding to what 33% of you said, which was, we see a future growth state here in Mississippi. Thank you very much.